Tanzania has just gone dark, not metaphorically but literally. Overnight, a nation of 60 million people was cut off from the world, its voice silenced. WhatsApp went blank, Facebook froze, even the humble text message gone. In Dar es Salaam, a city that once pulsed with the rhythm of conversation, there is only the low hum of generators and the echo of distant sirens. The lights are still on, but the truth has been switched off. As the internet collapsed below 10% of normal levels, the streets erupted. Young Tanzanians poured out into the avenues of Ubungo Kamara and Mwanza, chanting for justice, waving handwritten placards in the air, their only remaining form of communication. They say this is not just about votes. It's about being seen, being heard, and being free. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, seeking another term, calls it a measure for security. But what kind of security thrives in silence? What kind of democracy survives when the people cannot speak? The timing was no accident. The blackout began just as polling stations opened, leaving the nation blind to its own reflection. Outside Tanzania, the world scrolls on unaware that an entire nation has vanished from the digital map. And yet beneath the silence, a storm brews, one that could reshape East Africa's political future. Because when governments can turn off the internet, they can turn off the truth. If you believe that freedom depends on the ability to speak, stay with us. If you believe that no leader should rule in darkness, share this story. And if you believe that Africa deserves transparency, not silence, this report is for you. It began quietly, as most blackouts do. Around dawn on October 29, 2025, internet connectivity across Tanzania began to flicker and fade. At first, citizens thought it was a technical glitch, but by 8 a.m., it became clear this was no accident. The internet had been switched off nationwide. According to NetBlocks, the respected global observatory that tracks digital freedom, Tanzania's online traffic had plunged below 10% of normal levels just as polling stations opened. The directive, sources say, came directly from the Tanzania Communications Regulatory Authority, TCRA, executed silently by the country's largest telecoms, Vodacom, Airtel, Tigo, and Halotel. No official statement, no press conference, just silence. Within hours, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly Twitter, were all inaccessible. Bulk SMS services were blocked. Even VPN servers, the last refuge of digital dissent, were shut down. Tanzania had gone dark in every sense of the word. By noon, the country's digital life had flatlined. No photos, no live videos, no messages from one city to another. It was as if someone had erased an entire nation's heartbeat. But if the government hoped silence would bring calm, they were wrong. The streets began to roar. From Dar es Salaam's Ubungo district to the dusty crossroads of Kamara, thousands of young people, students, vendors, motorcycle riders poured onto the roads chanting, "Tunataka Haki, we want justice." They carried handwritten signs, burned tires, and blocked major highways. In some neighborhoods, they even pushed back police vehicles, forcing officers to retreat. Eyewitness videos that surfaced briefly before the blackout was complete showed chaotic scenes, protesters hurling tear gas canisters back at police, and in surreal moments, soldiers refusing to fire on civilians. It was not just a protest, it was a declaration of defiance. The tension had been building for weeks. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, seeking a second term under the banner of Chama cha Mapinduzi CCM, the same ruling party since independence, had already banned two major opposition parties from participating. Tundu Lissu and Luhagamina, leading opposition figures, were arrested days before the vote under accusations of inciting public disorder. Their parties, Chadema and Act Wazalendo, called for a nationwide boycott, saying, "Elections without choice are not democracy." As the ballots opened, it was clear the president was running virtually unopposed. Across major cities, voter turnout collapsed to an estimated 20%, a silent protest against what many called a coronation disguised as an election. Meanwhile, reports from Mwanza, Arusha, Dodoma, and Tunduma painted the same grim picture: ballot boxes dumped on roads, polling stations burned, and clashes between youth and police intensifying. And through it all, the internet remained dead. No independent journalists could verify claims. No citizens could upload proof. No one could tell the world what was really happening. That was the point. Control the signal, and you control the story. But amid the chaos, whispers spread of something extraordinary. Soldiers, ordinary conscripts, quietly joining protesters in some towns, saying they would not shoot their own people. It was a fragile but powerful moment, the line between state and citizen beginning to blur. For the first time in years, Tanzania's young generation born into silence had found their voice not through the internet but in the streets. And as the smoke rose over the city skyline, one truth became clear: this was not just a protest against an election, it was a protest against erasure. A nation cut off from the world was now screaming to be seen. By late afternoon, Dar es Salaam, the coastal jewel of East Africa, had turned into a storm of anger and disbelief. What began as isolated street marches had erupted into a full-scale civic uprising. The sound of tear gas canisters echoed through narrow alleys, mingled with chants that refused to fade. "Tunataka haki, we want justice!" they cried, their voices cracking through the choking smoke. But what made this uprising different was not only the scale, it was the silence that surrounded it. With the internet gone, no one outside Tanzania could see what was unfolding. No live streams, no journalists broadcasting the truth. Only brief, shaky clips that managed to escape before the blackout became total, grainy, pixelated but powerful. In one such clip, a group of young men stood in front of a burned polling station, holding their national flag upside down, the universal signal of distress. Another showed a mother crying beside her teenage son who had been hit by a rubber bullet, whispering, "They can't silence the blood." By sunset, reports of at least 6 polling stations set ablaze were confirmed by witnesses. In Mwanza and Arusha, clashes intensified. Police fired into crowds. Protesters hurled back stones, even tear gas shells collected from earlier raids. In one extraordinary moment, soldiers from a nearby barracks reportedly refused orders to shoot, choosing instead to escort women and children to safety. The crowd cheered them as heroes. That act of quiet rebellion would become the symbol of the night. Meanwhile, the economic and political costs of the blackout began to surface. Analysts estimated millions of dollars lost each day in stalled banking, trade, and logistics. Small businesses relying on digital payments, the backbone of Tanzania's informal economy, were paralyzed. For a country that once boasted one of East Africa's fastest-growing digital sectors, this was more than a setback. It was self-inflicted paralysis. As night fell, the world began to notice too late. At 8:00 p.m., international monitors and digital rights organizations sounded the alarm. NetBlock's Access Now and the Pokes Keep It On Coalition jointly released a statement calling the shutdown a deliberate assault on transparency and civic freedom. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemned it as a digital coup, the silencing of a nation. Even the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam issued an emergency alert warning American citizens to shelter in place and avoid large gatherings. The statement, brief and cautious, hinted at the seriousness of the situation without directly naming the president. Washington was watching, but not yet acting. Across East Africa, leaders held their breath. Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia, nations with histories of pre-election internet shutdowns, observed carefully. If this blackout strategy succeeded in Tanzania, it could become a template for controlling dissent across the continent. For those inside the country, the consequences were immediate and suffocating. Activists who attempted to bypass the blackout using VPNs were tracked and detained under the Cybercrime Act, a law critics say was designed less to prevent hacking than to criminalize dissent. Journalists were summoned, questioned, and ordered not to report without official authorization. By midnight, Dar es Salaam had gone eerily quiet again. But beneath that quiet, fear pulsed through the city like an electric current. A nation that had once been East Africa's digital success story, a pioneer in mobile banking and online entrepreneurship, now stood frozen in fear, disconnected from itself and from the world. And as the blackout deepened, Tanzanians began to realize the terrifying truth. This was not just about controlling protests, it was about controlling memory. When you erase the internet, you erase witnesses. When you erase witnesses, you erase accountability. And without accountability, democracy becomes nothing more than a slogan whispered into the dark. That night, as the lights flickered across the skyline, the world's newest democracy gasped for air, unseen, unheard, and utterly alone. The morning after the blackout, Tanzania woke up to a silence heavier than smoke. No one really knew what had happened overnight. Newsrooms were empty, radios silent, and social media still dark. Across the capital, Dar es Salaam, the air hung thick with confusion and exhaustion. People lined up at local kiosks hoping to find newspapers, but even the presses had been forced to halt for security reasons. In a country that once prided itself on peace and order, the illusion of stability had cracked. For millions of Tanzanians, this was not just an election crisis, it was an existential rupture. How do you trust a government that turns off the light when you ask to see the truth? Citizens felt betrayed. The blackout had cut more than connectivity. It had severed the bond of trust between the people and their institutions. Taxi drivers, teachers, small shop owners all whispered the same question. If they can silence us today, what will they do tomorrow? Human rights lawyers described the move as a state-engineered amnesia, a strategy to erase evidence and rewrite history before the world could witness it. With no videos, no independent coverage, and no public debate, the ruling party's narrative would stand unchallenged. But the damage extended far beyond politics. Thousands of families were unable to contact loved ones. Mobile money networks, the financial lifeline of the poor, went offline. Hospital supply chains reliant on digital systems began to falter. For the first time, people understood how deeply freedom and technology were intertwined. In Arusha and Mwanza, community leaders reported growing fear among youth. Some disappeared after joining protests. Others were seen taken into unmarked vehicles. Parents waited outside police stations with photographs in their hands, praying for news. The silence was no longer metaphorical, it was a weapon. Economists warned that the country's reputation as East Africa's business hub had been shattered. Foreign investors, once drawn by Tanzania's promise of digital innovation, now paused or withdrew. Confidence is easy to lose and almost impossible to rebuild, one analyst said. Politically, President Samia Suluhu Hassan appeared to have secured her second term, but at the cost of legitimacy. Her victory, even if officially declared, would carry the shadow of repression. The opposition parties weakened, but not broken, vowed to continue their struggle in every way still visible to the world. And across the region, governments were watching quietly, taking notes. From Kenya to Uganda, from Ethiopia to Rwanda, political strategists studied the Tanzanian model of digital control. If one blackout could quell dissent, could it become a regional doctrine? That was the chilling question spreading through East Africa's corridors of power. Meanwhile, among ordinary Tanzanians, a quieter movement began to rise. Citizens meeting in homes, in mosques, in churches, exchanging handwritten notes, rebuilding what had been lost. If they cut the signal, one youth activist said, "We will speak through the wind." Tanzania had entered a new chapter, a democracy without witnesses, a republic built on silence. And yet in that silence, something powerful began to stir. The determination of a people who, once silenced, realized how much their voice truly mattered. Outside Tanzania, the silence was deafening, but so was the hesitation. In Washington, statements came slow, cautious, measured. The U.S. Embassy's early advisory to avoid large gatherings and shelter in place was followed by a short message from the State Department expressing concern over the disruption of communication channels and reports of unrest. But there were no sanctions, no formal rebuke. Analysts in Washington whispered what few would say aloud. Samia Suluhu Hassan is seen as a stabilizing ally, a moderate face in a volatile region. Tanzania's cooperation on counterterrorism and regional trade had made her a safe partner. And in the cold calculus of geopolitics, stability often outweighs freedom. It was a familiar story. The same script had played out across the continent before silence, from the powerful outrage from the powerless. International human rights organizations, Amnesty International Human Rights Watch and Access Now filled the vacuum. They called the blackout a digital coup, warning that it could set a dangerous precedent for authoritarian governments worldwide. In Brussels, members of the European Parliament debated whether the blackout violated international treaties on freedom of expression. In Geneva, at the UN Human Rights Council, Tanzanian diplomats insisted the shutdown was temporary and for public safety. But the world was not convinced. African commentators from Nairobi to Accra voiced a darker worry. If Tanzania, once a symbol of peace, could silence its people so completely, what does that mean for Africa's democratic future? In Kenya, young activists used the hashtag #JoyWhereTanzania to demand accountability. In Uganda, opposition figures warned that what starts in one country never ends there. The blackout had become a regional alarm bell echoing across borders and time zones. For the United States, the crisis in Tanzania exposed an uncomfortable paradox. American leaders often speak of democracy and freedom abroad, yet Washington's muted response revealed how selective that defense can be. In an era when digital control has become the new frontier of power, the question is no longer whether governments will censor, but how far they will go when the world looks away. And as the U.S. weighed its words, another African leader was watching closely, one whose philosophy runs in the opposite direction. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has built his reputation on transparency, sovereignty, and information independence. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso developed local digital infrastructure designed not to silence citizens, but to protect their voice from foreign control. The contrast was striking and telling. While one African government turned off the internet to hide, another used technology to connect and empower its people. In global forums, some began to draw comparisons. Could Africa's future hinge not on imported models of governance, but on homegrown principles of accountability? For older Americans who remember the civil rights era, this struggle feels hauntingly familiar, the fight to speak, to be heard, to breathe freely under systems that prefer quiet obedience. And so, as Tanzania stands dimmed by digital darkness, the world faces a choice between convenience and conscience, between silence and solidarity. Because in the end, democracy doesn't die when people speak too loudly, it dies when those who can speak choose not to. As dawn breaks over Tanzania, the streets are quiet once more, too quiet. The smell of burned rubber still hangs in the air, mingled with the ghost of chants that once filled the night. The government says calm has returned, but calm built on fear is not peace. It is the silence before another storm. The blackout may end in hours or days. Internet lines will hum again, headlines will change, and the world will move on. But for the people who lived through this night, the students beaten, the mothers searching for their missing sons, the shopkeepers who lost their lifelines, the silence will echo long after the screens light up again. History will remember this not as a technical issue, but as a test of whether the world truly values freedom when it is inconvenient. Because the truth is this: in the 21st century, to cut the internet is to cut the soul of a nation. Across East Africa, governments are taking notes. Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia all have flirted with digital repression before. If the world rewards silence with silence, what message will that send? And to those watching from afar, especially in the United States, a nation built on the right to speak, protest, and assemble, this should strike a deep chord. Because democracy anywhere begins with the simple act of being heard. But there is another story being written on this same continent, one that points to a different path. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré speaks often of sovereignty through transparency. His government has invested in community networks, youth education, and public broadcasting owned by the people. His message is clear: technology should never be a weapon against citizens, but a shield for their dignity. The contrast between Tanzania and Burkina Faso is not just political, it is moral. One uses silence to control, the other uses voice to rebuild, and that difference may define the future of Africa's leadership in the years to come. So tonight, as Tanzania gasps for air in the dark, we must ask ourselves, what happens when truth goes offline? Who will speak for those who can't? If you believe that freedom must remain louder than fear, share this story. If you believe that silence is the enemy of democracy, subscribe, stay alert, and help keep the lights on. And if you believe that Africa deserves leaders who protect truth rather than hide it, stand with those who still dare to speak, because democracy doesn't need perfection. It only needs a voice.